The world between midnight and 4 in the morning belongs to a different kind of worker. Security guards at empty lots. Night watchmen at closed mills. One person, a flashlight, and acres of silence. They're paid to watch for trespassers, for fire, for trouble. But sometimes, the trouble was already there when they clocked in, and it's been waiting for someone to notice. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. Night security seems like an easy gig. Now walk the perimeter, shine a light on some fences, maybe doze in the booth between rounds. But the people who've actually done it will tell you the silence out there gets into your head. The way shadows shift under industrial lights, the way machinery creaks as it cools, sounding almost like footsteps. And then there are the nights when it's not just your imagination. Tonight we're following 3 night watchmen who took jobs watching over industrial yards in the middle of nowhere and discovered that nothing ever happens here was a lie. A scrapyard in California where the machinery had an appetite. A lumber mill in Oregon where something refused to leave the kill. And an equipment lot in the Inland Empire where the ground itself seemed to have a pulse. Grab your coffee, check your flashlight batteries, and let's clock in. Oren Vasquez had been working night security at Kettleman Scrap and Recycling for 8 months. And he'd learned exactly 3 things about the yard. The rats were the size of small dogs. The motion lights never worked on Tuesdays. And the old car compactor in the back corner made a sound like a dying whale when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. The job was simple. Clock in at 10 p.m. Do a foot patrol every 2 hours. Log anything unusual. Clock out at 6 a.m. The yard was 40 acres of rusting metal, stacked cars, and mountains of shredded aluminum, surrounded by chain link and razor wire. The only living things Oren ever saw were coyotes and the occasional tweaker trying to strip copper wire before Oren's spotlight sent them scrambling. On a Wednesday night in late November, the temperature dropped into the 20s, and Oren was on his 2 a.m. round when he heard the compactor kick on. He stopped dead halfway between the aluminum pile and the tire mountain. The compactor was a massive hydraulic beast. A green metal box the size of a semi-trailer with a crushing plate that could turn a sedan into a cube in about 90 seconds. It was supposed to be locked out at the breaker panel every night. Oren had checked the panel himself at 10:15. The breakers were off. The machine was cold. But there it was, the low, grinding hum of the hydraulic pump building pressure. Then the crunch. The unmistakable shriek of metal folding in on itself. Oren pulled his mag light and walked toward the sound, his boots crunching on frozen gravel. The compactor sat in a pool of sickly yellow light from a single pole lamp. The control panel on the side of the machine was dark. The emergency stop was engaged. But the crushing plate was moving, inching forward in short, jerky spasms. And inside the chamber something was being crushed. He couldn't see what. The feed hopper was empty, the conveyor belt still. But the sound of glass popping, metal groaning, something wet was coming from inside the sealed chamber. Oren reached for his radio to call his supervisor. The radio squawked static, and from the speaker, a voice that wasn't his supervisor's. A low, grinding whisper, like rocks rubbing together underwater. Feed me. Oren dropped the radio. The compactor cycled again, the plate retracting with a hydraulic sigh, then slamming forward. Crunch. Something dark and wet sprayed out of a seam in the machine's housing and splattered across the frozen ground at Oren's feet. It was warm. It smelled like iron and old pennies. He ran all the way back to the guard shack, slammed the door, and sat there shaking until the sun came up. At 6:15, when the day crew arrived, he walked out to the compactor with the foreman. The machine was cold. The breakers were still off, but there was a fresh dent in the crushing plata. Perfect impression of a human hand. Finger splayed, pressed into the steel from the inside. And on the ground beneath the machine, frozen solid in the morning cold, was a puddle of something dark that the foreman called hydraulic fluid and refused to discuss further. Orrin quit that morning. He heard later from one of the day guys that the compactor had been bought at auction from a yard in Bakersfield, where a worker had fallen into the hopper in 2008. They never found all of him. The machine had been cleaned, repainted, and sold. But Orrin knows what he heard that night, and he knows what left that handprint in the steel. Roscoe Tanner had been a night watchman for 30 years, at 7 different facilities, and he'd never been afraid of the dark. You don't last that long if you spook easy. The Tillamook lumber mill was his latest gig, a sprawling complex on the Oregon coast that processed Douglas fir into dimensional lumber. His rounds took him through the planer shed, the green chain, the sorting yard, and finally, to dry kilns for massive concrete and steel chambers, where fresh-cut lumber was baked for days at temperatures hot enough to kill anything living in the wood. The kilns were shut down for the winter, as had been for 2 months. The doors were open, the interiors cold and dark, smelling of baked sap and old carbon. Cool. Roscoe walked through them every night, his flashlight sweeping across empty steel tracks and piles of fallen bark. On a wet January night, with rain hammering the metal roof like a drum, Roscoe was in kill number 3 when he heard humming. He stopped, killed his light. Listened. The hum was faint, coming from the far end of the kill, near the control booth that overlooked the chamber. It was a tune, something old. A song his grandmother used to sing. Down in the valley so low. Roscoe clicked his light back on and swept the beam toward the booth. The glass window of the control booth was fogged over from the inside, and behind the fogged glass, a shape, silhouette. Small, hunched, rocking slowly back and forth. Roscoe had dealt with trespassers before, homeless folks looking for a dry place to sleep. He called out, "Mill's closed. Can't be in here. Come on out, and I won't call the sheriff." The humming stopped. The silhouette stopped rocking. Then, from inside the booth, a voice, thin and reedy, like an old man who'd breathed too much sawdust. "I can't come out. I'm still drying." Roscoe felt the temperature in the kill drop. It's not just cold, the kind of deep, unnatural cold that seeps into your bones. His breath fogged in front of his face. He took a step toward the booth. And that's when his light caught the floor of the kill. The steel tracks were frosted over. Ice crystals were forming on the concrete walls. And in the control booth, the silhouette pressed a hand against the fogged glass. The hand was small, withered, the fingers long and twisted. Roscoe turned and walked. He didn't run. He was too old to run back through the kill, out into the rain and straight to his truck. He called the night manager from the cab and told him there was a squatter in kill 3. The manager sighed. Kill 3 figures. "You know what happened in there, in '89? Roscoe didn't, the manager told him. In the summer of 1989, a kill operator named Vernon Phelps had a heart attack while doing a temperature check inside kill 3. The door swung shut behind him and latched. The kill was running a cycle at 180 degrees. They found him 3 days later when the load was done. He'd crawled into the control booth, but the heat had still gotten him. They'd cleaned the booth, replaced the glass, kept using the kill. But every winter, when the kilns were cold, the night watchman reported strange things. Frost in August, a handprint on the glass, and sometimes, if you listened close, a man humming an old gospel tune. Roscoe finished his shift that night in the guard shack. The doors locked, the lights on, but in his 2 weeks' notice the next morning, told him his knees were giving out. He didn't mention the cold. He didn't mention the hand. And he never listened to his grandmother's old records again. Delia. Okonkwo was a former MP who'd gotten out of the army and taken a job doing overnight security at a heavy equipment rental yard in Fontana. She liked the solitude. After 2 tours in Iraq, the quiet of a dirt lot full of sleeping bulldozers was a relief. Her job was simple. Drive the perimeter in a beat-up Ford Ranger every hour. Check the gate locks. Make sure no one was siphoning diesel or stripping copper from the machines. The lot was 60 acres of packed earth, surrounded by chain link and motion-activated floods. On a moonless night in March, Delia was making her 1 a.m. round when she saw something that didn't belong. At the far end of the lot, past the rows of excavators and the pile of concrete Jersey barriers, something was moving, not a person, too big, too slow. She killed the truck's headlights and watched. Caterpillar D9 bulldozer, massive machine, 60 tons of steel and track swaths crawling across the lot, not driving, crawling. The blade was down, scraping the dirt, and the tracks were turning, but there was no engine noise. No diesel rumble, no exhaust. Just the low, grinding squeal of metal on metal and the crunch of earth being pushed. Delia grabbed her handheld spotlight and aimed it at the dozer. The cab was empty. She could see straight through the glass. No one at the controls. But the machine was moving, inching forward, its blade carving a shallow trench in the hard-packed dirt. She radioed the main office. No answer. She tried her cell. No signal. She sat in the truck, watching the dozer crawl another 20 feet, then stop. The blade lowered to the ground with a heavy thud. The tracks went still. And then, from somewhere near the machine, she heard a sound she knew from her time in the desert. The sound of digging, not mechanical digging hand, digging. The scrape of a shovel in dirt. Rhythmic, deliberate. She grabbed her mag light and her sidearm and stepped out of the truck. Security. Is anyone out there? Identify yourself? The digging stopped. The silence was absolute. Even the distant hum of the freeway seemed to have faded. Then the dozer's headlights flicked on, its blinding white beams that pinned Delia like a spotlight on a prisoner. And from behind those lights, a voice, deep, slow, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river, not deep enough yet. The dozer's engine turned over once, twice, caught. The roar of the diesel shattered the silence. The tracks began to turn again, the machine pivoting slowly toward Delia. She didn't wait. She ran for the truck, threw it in reverse, and fishtailed back toward the gate. In her rearview mirror, she saw the dozer's lights following her, the massive machine turning to face her escape route. She punched the gate code with shaking fingers, the chain link rattling as the dozer's rumble grew louder behind her. The gate swung open. She floored it through, out onto the empty surface street, and didn't stop until she reached a 24-hour Denny's 3 miles away. She called her supervisor from the parking lot, her voice cracking. Something's wrong with the D9 in the back lot. It's moving on its own. The supervisor was quiet for a long moment. Then Delia, we sold the D9 last week. It got hauled off on a lowboy Tuesday. There's nothing back there but dirt. Delia quit that night. She drove home, packed a bag, and moved to Arizona to work security at a shopping mall where the only thing that moved at night was the cleaning crew. but she still thinks about that trench the dozer was digging, and what it might have been digging for, and what would have happened if it had finished. 3 night watchmen, 3 industrial yards, and 3 encounters that prove the graveyard shift earns its name. Orrin Vasquez discovered that some machinery develops an appetite. Roscoe Tanner learned that some workers never truly clock out, even after death. And Delia Okonkwo found out that sometimes the ground itself remembers things we've tried to bury. If you've ever worked a lonely night shift security, maintenance, trucking, anything that puts you in the middle of nowhere while the rest of the world sleeps, you know that feeling. It's the one that says you're being watched by something the daylight never sees. That's what we document here at True Terror Files Official. If you've got a story like this, something that happened on a quiet night when you were supposed to be alone, drop it in the comments. We read every single one. Like, subscribe, ring that bell. And the next time you're on a night shift and you hear machinery start up on its own, you don't go check it out alone.